Hello, I am Violetta Trofimova, and the topic of my paper is the rise of women's literature in late 17th century England in the light of gender studies, feminist literary theory, and network analysis. Feminist literary theory showed a division between mainstream, predominantly male literary history and literary history of the minority groups, often forgotten and suppressed and mostly female. English literary history is a good example of such division. Some English women writers have occupied their proper place in English literary canon, even those whose works were considered problematic in their lifetime and were stigmatized and even forgotten afterwards. Such is the case of Aphra Behn, generally considered the first professional woman writer in England and the mother of English novels. Nevertheless, Aphra Behn was often treated as an exception, and her works were analyzed separately from those by other women authors of her time. In this paper, I am going to reveal how feminist literary theory, gender studies, and also sociological network analysis can help understand the phenomenon of the female literary creativity in England in the 1690s. The crucial date here is the year 1696, when more than one-third of the new plays in England were written by women or adapted from women's works. Mutual support of such women writers as Catherine Trotter, Mary Picks, and Delarevere Manley, as well as their acknowledgments to women predecessors, will be pointed out. The 1690s lacked such great literary figures as Shakespeare and Milton. John Dryden was still alive, but his most important works, poetic, dramatic, and those of literary criticism, had already been written. Therefore, probably, minor literary figures were often ignored by scholars of English literature. As some of those minor writers were women, they were automatically excluded from English literary canon and even literary history. For example, such women writers as Catherine Trotter, Delarevere Manley, and Mary Picks were not mentioned in Harry Blemire's Short History of English Literature, first published in 1974. Among important women writers of the period, he mentions only Aphra Behn and Susanna Centlivre. It is significant that Trotter's and Picks's works had not been republished before the beginning of the new millennium. Moreover, the studies of their works just occasionally appeared in the 1970s and 1980s. On the contrary, a few articles and even monographs dedicated to Manley and Centlivre were published as early as in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. Two monographs on Centlivre appeared in the USA in 1952 and 1979. Anyway, systematic and comprehensive study of early modern women writers in England bloomed in the 1990s and afterwards. The monograph Women and Literature in Britain, 1500-1700, edited by Helen Wilcox, was called, quote, the first comprehensive introduction to the works and social context of women writers in early modern Britain, and contained a chapter by Ross Ballaster on the first female dramatist. As for the texts by English women writers of the late 17th century, apart from Behn's and Centlivre's works, they were mainly republished in the first years of the new millennium. Manley's novels were reissued as early as in 1971, but most of women's plays from the 1690s appeared in print only in 2001 in a multi-volume edition entitled 18th Century Women Playwrights. Immediately after that, the special studies of Catherine Trotter and Delarevere Manley were published. Anne Kelly explicitly showed feminist perspective in the title of her book, Catherine Trotter, an early modern writer in the vanguard of feminism, 2002. Finally, not only the phenomenon of female dramatists in late 17th century England, but also the achievements of early modern women novelists were acknowledged, for example, in the book by Stephen Moore, The English Novel / The Novel, An Alternative History, 2013. The author discusses prose fiction by Catherine Trotter, Mary Picks, and Delarive Manley, apart from Afro-Ben. He points out originality of Olinda's Adventures by Trotter, 1693, skepticism towards human nature in The Inhuman Cardinal by Picks, and calls Adventures of Rivella by Manley, quote, a significant declaration of independence for British women writers, end of quote. As for feminist literary theory, such works often do not discuss English women writers of the late 17th century at all. For example, in Cambridge Companion to Feminist Literary Theory, only Afra-Ben and Delarive Manley are mentioned. Other books of this kind lack any references to such women writers. The history books dedicated to early modern women writers in England, on the contrary, contain long discussions of their work. The theatrical season of 1695-96 in London attracted particular attention of feminist literary historians. It was unique, in Beckscheider's words quoted by Bernadette Andrea, absolutely unique in British history. 7 years after Afra-Ben's death in 1689, her histories and novels were published. The debut performance of her play Younger Brother took place, and Thomas Southern's adaptation of her novel Oronoka was staged. This significant revival of Ben's works coincided with the appearance of 4 new women playwrights: Catherine Trotter, Mary Picks, Delarive Manley, and mysterious Ariadne. With the exception of another mysterious woman writer, Ophelia, whose lost play The Pair Royal of Coxcomb was presumably presented at a dancing school in 1678, and Anne de la Roche-Guillem's French opera Rare en Tout, staged in 1677 in Whitehall on the occasion of King Charles II's birthday, Afra-Ben was the only female dramatist who wrote plays for public stage from 1671 to 1689. Trotter's tragedy, Agnes de Castro, based on Afra-Ben's translation of the French novella of the same title, and She Ventures and He Wins by Ariadne, were staged only in 1695. They were followed by the plays of Mary Picks and Delarive Manley. Rose Ballaster posed the question, what conditions, quote, enabled women like Mary Picks to enter the public language of the stage at the end of the 17th century, end of quote. She points out 2 main factors: the advent of print culture in late 17th century England and increased literacy among women of the middle classes. Middle-class women, quote, had less to lose in public display than their aristocratic predecessors, end of quote. Although female dramatists of the 1690s did not conceal their sex and often published their plays under their real names, they still cared about their reputation. For example, a poetess, Elizabeth Singer, was considered in an anonymous commendatory poem attached to her Poems on Several Occasions, 1696, a virtuous version of Afra-Ben, quote, Ben reformed in thee revive, end of quote. Such playwrights as Catherine Trotter and Mary Picks also cared about their reputation. Moreover, there were married women who did not want to make their lives scandalous. It was Delarive Manley who exploited the piquant details of her private life in her prose fiction and was not ashamed of that. While the spread of print culture and the rise of literacy are very important factors for the development of women's writing in late 17th century England, the invention of a tradition of female literature and friendship between women writers were no less determining. Some feminist scholars paid special attention to these issues. Jane Spencer in Aphra-Behn's Afterlife does not call permanent references in women's literature of the 1690s to three poetesses, Sappho, Catherine Phillips, Orinda, and Aphra-Behn, Astrea, an invention of female literary tradition, but sticks to, quote, a female line of poetic succession, end quote. She compares it to the male Sidney Spencer Johnson line and points out its fictionality. In Spencer's opinion, this female genealogy implies throne imagery. A female empire is constructed which rivals the male one. For some reason, Spencer does not make a political analogy with the ascendance of Mary II to the English throne, together with her husband William III, although Mary was an important figure to contemplate the possibility of a female succession. Nevertheless, the Sappho-Orinda-Astrea line made female ancestry and inheritance thinkable. The daughters of Aphra-Behn in drama, poetry and prose fiction made a female writer not a solitary and marginalized figure, but someone who has predecessors before her and fellow authors of her own sex around her. It is remarkable how often Aphra-Behn and Catherine Phillips are mentioned in the commendatory poems to women's works in the 1690s. Manly mentions Orinda and the fair Astrea in her poem to Trotter's Agnes de Castro. The prologue to Ariadne's She Ventures and He Wins contains references to charming Aphra and Orinda. Ariadne also points out the example of the incomparable Mrs. Behn in her preface to the play. Mary Piggs mentions Aphra eloquent and chaste Orinda. In the commendatory poem to Manly's play, The Royal Mischief, not only the playwrights, but the authors of polemical treatises, as well as the poets, also paid a tribute to Behn's and Phillips' memories. The anonymous author of An Essay in Defense of the Female Sex pointed out, quote, the noble examples of the deservedly celebrated Mrs. Phillips and the incomparable Mrs. Behn, end of quote. And the commendatory poem to the same essay mentions famed Orinda and Astrea. As I have already said, a commendatory poem attached to Singer's poems on several occasions also referred to Behn and chaste Orinda, while Elizabeth Johnson, in her preface, cited Behn among a number of female worthies in proof of female ability, together with Orinda and even Schurman, a Dutch polymath, Anna-Maria van Schurman, whose writings were translated into English in the mid-17th century. All the above-mentioned works appeared in the years 1695-96. The later works also referred to Aphra-Behn and Catherine Phillips. An anonymous commendatory poem to Trotter's tragedy The Fatal Friendship, 1698, mentions the famed Orinda's and Astrea's lays. In 1701, Lady Sarah Piers expressed a more critical attitude to Orinda and Astrea in her commendatory poem to Trotter's Unhappy Penitent. She called Orinda too conscious of female weakness, while Astrea left a spacious room to criticize. Nevertheless, in 1703, an author of commendatory verses to Sarah Fige Egerton's poems on several occasions mentioned Orinda's judgment and Astrea's fire. As late as in 1709, the article in the periodical Female Tatler compared Susanna St. Lever to the inimitable Mrs. Behn. Ironically, St. Lever, who was the most obvious successor to Behn on the English stage, did not mention her predecessor in her writing. On the whole, it became almost a commonplace to refer to Ben and Phillips while speaking about women's literary works of the late 17th and the early 18th century England. Friendship between women writers of the 1690s and the beginning of the 1700s is often discussed by feminist literary historians, but it is not included in the major factors of the development of women's literature in England. In this case, feminist literary theory may be supplied by the elements of social network analysis, the method which makes it possible to study people's networks and the spread of objects as well as ideas across such networks. It can also help explain the socio-cultural phenomena based on people's relationships and communication. If we talk about the rise of women authors in late 17th century England, it can be partly explained by the mutual support of the female writers. We see such support in their commendatory verses and also in their correspondence. Della Manley contributed a poem to Catherine Trotter's Agnes de Castro. Lady Sarah Piers wrote commendatory verses to Trotter's Fatal Friendship. Mary Picks provided a poem to Della Manley's Royal Mischief. Susanna St. Lever contributed commendatory verses to the volume of Sarah Fige Egerton's poems. Moreover, we know about the friendship between Catherine Trotter and Elizabeth Singer. It is remarkable that Ariadne's debut play did not contain any commendatory poems, and the author, under this pseudonym, disappeared immediately afterwards. As for Trotter, Manley, Picks and St. Lever, as well as Singer and Egerton, they all went on publishing and producing new editions of their works. When Mary Picks died in 1709, her friend Susanna St. Lever, the most successful playwright of them all, organized a charitable production of her own play, The Busybody, to support late Picks's family. An interesting example of women writers' literary collaboration is the volume produced in the memory of the late John Dryden. It came out in London in 1700 under the title The 9 Muses, or Poems Written by 9 Several Ladies upon the death of the late famous John Dryden, Esquire, and contained only female verses. The editor of the volume and one of the contributors was Della Manley, while the other participants were Susanna St. Lever, Sarah Fige Egerton, Mary Picks, Catherine Trotter, Lady Sarah Piers, and an identified Mrs. D.E. Manley at that point was eager to express solidarity with the other women writers. Later, she became critical of some of her women friends. Jane Spencer expressed an idea that construction of a separate, entirely female tradition threatened to lock women writers into a literary historical ghetto. This separatism can provide one of the explanations why the majority of the women authors discussed in this paper were forgotten afterwards. Significantly, it was Susanna St. Lever, the least separatist of the company, and her works that survived her death and were staged and reprinted in the 19th century. Catherine Trotter got married and, as Catherine Cockburn, became a defender of John Locke and an important woman philosopher in the 18th century England. Incidentally, Sarah Fige Egerton was also inclined towards science and philosophy, writing poems about Boyle, Descartes, and Aristotle. Philosophy and science became fashionable in early 18th century England. Thank you very much.